Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Springer Nature Black Employee Network Speaker Series. I'm Devin Williams, and today, for our seventh installment of the series, I'm joined by Maynard Okereke, also known as the Hop M.D. How are you doing today, Maynard?
Fantastic. Doing fantastic. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. Glad to hear you're doing well.
hmm
So, I understand you're an entrepreneur, so I'd like to ask you, when did you start your business?
yeah, I am an entrepreneur. Depending on which business, have varies with the Hip Hop Science platform. I've been doing this pretty much as a business now for past 2 years. Kind of started off as kind of a sketch idea, and it's evolved now into this STEM education platform where I do a lot of outreach and have discussions on diversity and inclusion in STEM and doing creative content. But I'm also an owner of a food business as well, which I've been doing for the past 5 years as a full-fledged business. So having my hands in multiple different areas, but entrepreneurship has been something that's always been special to me and always something that I wanted to pursue. So it's been an amazing journey being able to run two businesses that are two things that I'm really passionate about.
Well, that sounds great, and I'm glad to hear you're expanding a little bit and dabbling in a little bit of both as far as the fields you're in.
Mhm.
Definitely reach out to me after for the food. I'd love to hear more about that business.
Yes.
Could you tell me a little bit about your involvement as far as what you do in STEM?
hmm Yeah, so I started a platform called Hip Hop Science, where I use music, entertainment, and comedy as tools to educate on a wide variety of scientific subjects. For people that kind of know the fields, I always tagline it as Bill Nye meets World Star. And it's really just a creative way to get people excited about science, right? So my background's in civil and environmental engineering. But I've also done a lot of extensive work in entertainment, working as an actor, as a producer, as a writer, and also as a music artist. And entertainment has been something that's always been like in my heart and something I've always been connected with. And something that I've always been involved in all my life. And I really wanted to find a way to bring these two seemingly contrasting fields together. And it's been awesome kind of going on this journey. And I work with a lot of different institutions, K through 12. I work with companies and corporations and organizations about diversity. And I really noticed a lack of involvement with minorities and youth in STEM. And I really wanted to find a way to be able to connect them into those fields. And what better way to do that than with entertainment field that we always consume, whether it's media through movies and music and social media, to now use this as a tool to really be able to uplift underserved communities and really give them involvement into STEM, an area that we are not traditionally seen in. And so that's really been the goal of the whole Hip Hop Science platform.
Well, Maynard, you really sound like the jack of all trades, working with both children and institutions with a background in civil engineering. With
Mhm.
all of that experience, would you be able to narrow down your three most gratifying accomplishments to date?
Yeah, absolutely. Two of them were really this year. I recently came back from a month-long expedition at sea. I was with this organization called Ocean Exploration Trust, and I got a chance to go on board the Nautilus Live, which is this really unique research vessel founded by Dr. Ballard. He was one of the discoverers of the Titanic. And it was an amazing mission. It was something that I'd always had a dream of doing ever since I was a little kid. Always envisioned myself being on this Nat Geo research team, whether it was going through the jungle or deep sea and doing some really deep rooted scientific research. And I had a chance to do that with this platform. And they brought me on board as a science communicator on the ship. And so I was communicating all of the different things, the discoveries, the instrumentations that we were working with, the biological discoveries, the ROVs, the technology. And I was communicating this to outlets offshore, whether it was to schools and colleges, and getting people excited about the research work that we're doing. And we're deploying instruments on the deep sea to record seismic data. We're collecting samples from the deep sea. We're researching areas of unexplored hydrothermal vents. So it was an awesome experience just to be part of a team and really get hands on with some research. Another amazing thing that I did with the platform this year was I had a chance to go on a zero gravity flight as part of this program with Space for Humanity. They brought me on board because of my hip hop science platform. I released a video talking about the importance of space exploration and representation in the space sciences, right? Because that's another area where you don't traditionally see Black and brown voices. And I really highlighted what type of impact that going on a zero gravity flight would have on not only my platform but myself, and for representation. And they brought me on board to go on this trip, and so we did 16 parabolas on this plane called Go Zero G, and we were able to experience weightlessness just like astronauts do in space. And that was definitely a life changing moment. Had a chance to really be able to get that experience that we all kind of dream about as a kid, right? Becoming an astronaut and having that experience. So that was absolutely amazing. And then another thing that I'm doing right now, and it's always been something in the works, but I've always called this program Hip Hop Science Show because the goal has always been to develop this into a full-fledged production, right? If I'm using music and media and entertainment to educate, I would love to take this to the masses and be able to bring that on a larger scale. And so I've been in and out of development deals with different production companies, which has been pretty awesome, just seeing the interest from people on working on this to develop this as a show. And so I've had opportunities to work with different production media companies and develop it into a show. And Hollywood can be a very fickle space, so been kind of up and down, but I have some opportunities right now in the works to really develop this into kind of a more mainstream platform, which I'm super excited about. And just seeing the excitement that people have around the program and the work that it's doing in the outreach with different underserved communities and just people in science in general has been really exciting. So that's something I'm really looking forward to as well.
That is awesome, and I have no doubt that with your experience and reach at the Hip Hop Science Show is going to work out. That sounds so cool. I have to.
Appreciate that.
The ocean exploration is amazing, but I am a sucker for the zero G flight. I have to
Yeah.
know what was it like being weightless.
It was a very surreal feeling for sure because there's so much prep leading to it, and you see these images of astronauts floating in space, and you have a perception in your head of what that moment is going to feel like. But when you're actually in it, it's such an outer body experience, right? You almost see yourself floating around in space, and it doesn't feel like it's real. But it's such the kind of emotional moment because you tying in all these experiences of things that you've seen and then having that opportunity to literally be floating around in this plane, and you're pushing yourself off the walls and doing flips and everything, and looking back at it after you see the videos, it just feels so unbelievable. But it was a unique experience, and then to be able to do it with some amazing people was even more special, to be able to share that moment. But if anybody has an opportunity to go zero G, it's definitely something worth doing, and I think that's why there's such a connection to especially these civilian space flights that we're seeing with like Virgin Galactic and SpaceX and Inspiration 4, right? To be able to see civilians now, people that don't have years and years of astronaut training, now having the opportunity to go and experience something that only a few people have the opportunity to do. So it's really cool to be able to be in that spectrum now, having that opportunity to go weightless.
That is so cool, and I definitely would describe it as a unique experience. I hope one day I have that experience. It's definitely been a dream of
Absolutely.
mine. That
Yeah.
is just,
Speak it into
it's
existence. I'm all
very
about speaking
cool.
things into existence.
I certainly will. It's really cool to have a first person account of what that experience was like. I would have never thought that I would meet someone with that experience.
Yeah.
In terms
Mhm.
actually of experience, what would you say has been your experience with diversity in STEM when you started your career in comparison to now?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think really this hip hop science platform was a development of that journey, right? It was kind of a result of that journey. Like I said, I graduated from University of Washington in Seattle with a degree in civil environmental engineering. And all throughout my schooling at University of Washington, I was one of very few minorities in all my classes, right? And even in high school, right? I went to high school in Vancouver, Washington, not a very diverse community. So I'd always been kind of used to being the one of few, right? And it became more prevalent as I got older, and especially as I got into the workspace and the work field, going into my job as a lead engineer on a project. and walking into a room and people not believing that I was the lead scientist on a project or lead engineer on a project, and kind of overlooking me or overlooking my skills or abilities or what I brought to the table because they hadn't seen somebody that looked like me in that position, right? So having those experiences while I was working professionally was something that really impacted me, and always something that stood front and center, right? And as I continued to develop this platform and continue to build this community, you start to hear stories of other people that have been in that same position. I started meeting other Black engineers from different cities and different states, right, that have gone through the same experiences. People in the medical fields, right? People in tech. You start to now see this kind of broad spectrum of diversity and inclusion and lack of representation in these fields. And particularly last year, when you had a lot of the racial injustice going on, and there was a true light that was shed on all of the inequities that were happening within our community. It brought to light all of these feelings, right, and emotions, and we're able to share these experiences with each other. And that's something that's always been pivotal in my platform, and something that I always keep front and center with my platform, is touching on representation and touching on diversity in science, right, and addressing the lack of minorities in these positions. And so for me, it's been a result of that journey and having those experiences and going from one position where I just thought that this was the norm and it was just part of life of me being the one of few in my position, to now learning about other people's journeys and seeing the similar problems that people are having in their own spaces, in their own communities as well too, and then now collectively joining voices and finding ways that we can really highlight these on our platforms. And that's been the most special part about having this science communicator community that we've been in now, is you have all of these diverse voices sharing these stories and bringing them to the light. And now we're starting to see a lot more representation happening in these fields, and diversity and inclusion being a topic that's readily brought up now in organizations and companies, right, of how they can be more inclusive and bring more minorities into these fields. And so it's really been special being able to highlight that in the work that I do, not only in driving excitement to our K through 12 and college students, but then also working with companies and organizations about how they can not only bring in more diverse workforce, but also to retain that workforce and find ways to be able to lead them and push them into positions of power as well. So that kind of whole full spectrum is what's been really special about that journey of seeing how diversity and inclusion has affected everything that I've been doing in my work.
That's excellent. I'm glad that you mentioned retention. I think that's a big part of that conversation as far as touching on
Yeah.
diversity points rather than trends, for example, making
Hmm.
sure that we have those minorities in STEM and that they stay in STEM and continue to have an
Yeah.
interest and bring in more individuals like themselves. Do you
Hmm.
feel that the conversation on race and STEM has been a priority?
Hmm. Um, I don't feel that it's been a priority. It's something that is been brought to light more, you know. And I think it's also a weird shift, right? Because you think about all the momentum that happened last year, right? Especially after George Floyd, and you start to see the riots everywhere and protests all throughout the United States, and then it spread globally, and you had people in Europe protesting as well too for inequities that were taking place, and you started to see this kind of global collaborative effort, right? Which I think was also spearheaded a little bit too by this pandemic, right? The kind of the world stood still, and we had this time to focus and realize all these different things, and distractions were put out the door. And so all these injustices that had been happening for decades within our communities were now brought, front face and center for people to see and realize, like, oh, Black people have been dealing with this for a long time. And you kind of had this kind of white guilt moment of people realizing that we have been non-inclusive, we haven't been listening to Black and brown voices, and there was a really big push for that. And even just kind of over the past year, you've seen that effect, and it's kind of just how society is, right? You have these things that are really hot topics for a while, and then they stay there for a little bit, and then they kind of decline, and then it kind of rises back, and it kind of declines. And that's the unfortunate part, right? Because last year there was a lot of momentum being addressed to inequities and racial injustice, and focusing on diversity and inclusion, because that was the hot thing, right? But as times have changed and new things have happened with the pandemic, and the landscape of the world has changed, and new distractions have come to the table, you start to see a slow disconnect again. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now. People now put their positions in place at companies and organizations to specifically address diversity and inclusion and impact, and really trying to work on retention and getting more Black and brown voices in the workforce. But now it's kind of a little swept under the rug. Companies that have been about that and putting their money where their mouth is, that have been doing that work, know who they are and are consistently doing that work. But it's always kind of a cycle, and this is kind of the trend that it's always been on for generations, right? We'll address something and then we'll do some work and some efforts, and then things kind of go back to the norm again. And it's really up to us to really keep putting that in the forefront, right? Keep having those discussions, holding people accountable, finding ways that we make this a regular discussion and not just a trending discussion. I think we're still in the phase of trendy more so than this is a regular thing that needs to be addressed, and something that always needs to be itemized whenever we're discussing anything with companies and financial wealth and structural organizations. This is something that needs to be right as a lead topic. And unfortunately, I don't think it's in that phase right now. And there's lots of work that we still need to do to make sure that we address this and make sure that we hold people accountable as well.
I agree. I think there's a lot more work to be done. And I also agree to your point about when the world stood still, as you put it, with the pandemic. I think no distractions went really far, unfortunately, given the circumstances, but no distractions went really far in terms of the awareness that took place as far as the injustices that were
Hmm.
happening all over, particularly here with George Floyd, as you mentioned, and
Yep.
also that expanded into the workplace. Um, and I wanted to ask you, stemming from the experiences that you just talked to me about, what would you change, or what do you think needs to be changed for the betterment of Black colleagues within the next generation for their progression when they're navigating their careers in STEM?
Hmm. Yeah. It's a tough question because there's so many different layers, right, and so many different parts and pieces that have to change and be affected in order for us to really see any type of significant impact. But for me, and especially within the work that I do, I think it's always important to start early, start at our youth level, right? Because if we don't introduce our youth into these fields, we don't introduce our youth as far as addressing different inequities and whatnot, and put our youth in position to gain knowledge and to be educated, then we're doing an injustice, right? Because we're starting them off on the wrong foot. And I think a lot of times, one thing that I try to do with my platform is introducing youth to the science fields and STEM fields, right? Because there's so much opportunity, not only to have success, but also to be able to build strong careers, make a strong societal impact, right? And be able to be part of the leading fields, right? Because you look at technology, you look at engineering, that the sciences are what's going to lead and innovate us into the future. And it's important that we have our voices represented in these fields in order to really be able to make significant change in our future. And if we're left out of these fields, we're left out about how we're going to affect society. And so to really get our youth introduced into the STEM fields, I think is critically important. And that comes from both introducing them and showing representation in these areas, but also financial support, right? Being able to help underserved schools and underprivileged youth and underprivileged communities, right? And uplifting them and empowering them and giving them the financial stability that they need to be able to start off on the right foot is really important. And then obviously support needs to happen all throughout that area, right? Bringing them into the fields, keeping them interested, engaged, even as they get into the high school level and then into college level as well. But then by the time you get into the workforce, it's not just about retaining that workforce and getting them in those positions, but now it's how do we uplift them and put them in positions of power so they can now give back and continue to reach out and bring others up along with them as well too. And that's an area that we lack, right? We can get into these doors, but what's unfortunately not happening is we're not getting to these positions of power where we can now have influence on the next generation, have influence on the companies and the organizations and how they're structured to go into the future if we're not in leadership positions, presidents, vice presidents, right? Lead development positions, positions of power that are going to have influence and make change, not just being in a diversity and inclusion role or not just being a regular employee, and not just being in these kind of lower level positions where we kind of bounce around, to be able to be in these positions where we can now have a structural impact of how the organization works and the finances and the funding and where these opportunities are now being afforded to. That's what's going to give us longevity to be able to not only bring our youth, but keep them there and then also lead us into the future.
I completely agree. I mean, you mentioned the layers in terms of the cycle that needs to happen in order for this retention, starting everyone young, and I completely agree. I think it's a nurturing effect, right? You start
Mhm.
everyone young, then you support them financially as well as getting them to the next step in STEM, getting them to become college students within STEM and continuing that all the way up to a position of power, as you said, where they can give back and the
Yep.
cycle continues. So I think that's very important.
Mhm.
What advice would you give Black graduates who are entering your area of STEM, or the area of STEM that you previously worked in or currently work in?
Yeah. I would say, and this kind of goes even outside of just engineering, but all areas of STEM in general, and even outside of STEM, whether you are going to business or whether you're going to marketing or being a lawyer, whatever it is, whatever path that you're taking. Important thing is to really build a community, right? And you're going to need that as you get older and you get into the workforce because it's a unique change when you graduate and you start working professionally. And I think we touched on this before, but like you kind of go from this process of you're going to school, you're doing tests, and you always have somebody to report to and some report to do, and you kind of get used to this cycle of education, right, and responsibility, and then you graduate and you realize that the world is your oyster. If you start working, you go to your job, you work your 8 to 10 to 12 hours, whatever it is, and then you have the rest of the time to just kind of figure out what you want to do with your life, right? And a lot of times that can be a really difficult transition, especially for college graduates. And I think the important thing is to really build that community, find that structure around you where you can not only have a support group of people, of peers, that you can really see their paths and see what other people are doing and get inspired, but also have positions and people that you hold each other accountable, right? And maybe you can collaborate on different efforts, and now you're able to have this community where it's like becomes a support group, and you're able to uplift each other, and you're able to find other opportunities for each other, and you're able to get creative and really develop some new things, right? And take advantage of some things that we may have not had opportunity to be a part of before. And I think that's really important. And I think for me, kind of understanding that a little bit later on, that's something I wish I'd done earlier as soon as I graduated, having that stronger support system and really being initiated into that a lot more. But I think that's a really good foundation. Finding those peers that you can really jive with, and you can really do some strong make some strong kind of momentum in whatever area that you're in, and really take advantage of the opportunities that are out there. So that would be kind of my best advice: is build that community, find your niche, find your tribe, as they say, and that's going to be a good foundation that's going to be able to uplift you no matter what path that you're going on in your future.
Maynard, I completely agree. I think having that community, having that support system really goes a long way. And that actually leads into my next question of, did you have any role models that inspired your career? And if so, how did their efforts impact you?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. This has always been a tough one, right? Because I I didn't have a lot of people that would look like me that are doing things in my field. Right? So I didn't have a lot of like inspiration per se, as far as uh, higher level mentors or whatnot. My parents weren't in STEM. This was an area that I just kind of navigated myself. Right? I had an interest from early on. My parents were definitely influential early on in my life as far as giving me access to things. I remember because I wanted to actually go into wildlife biology before I ended up going into engineering. And that stemmed from me having access to exploring and learning new things. My mom gave me these wildlife fact cards that I was able to just kind of read off random facts about, mating habits and geographic locations of different organisms, right? And I collected this whole binder of wildlife fact cards, and it was this subscription deal that I had on, and my parents gave me that opportunity, right, to have access to things that I was interested in, and that kept me motivated and kept me interested in the sciences, right? And so early on, that was definitely something that was afforded to me. But by the time I got into college, really the thing that helped me was peers, right? I was able to connect with a lot of people that are doing amazing work in my area. And I'm a big believer in keeping good, supportive people around you that are going to inspire you and motivate you, right? And I want to be able to see my friends doing amazing things and be like, I want to do that. That's the path that I want to go on. And I was fortunate enough to have a lot of supportive friends and a lot of friends that were geniuses in their own right, doing amazing work, and people that kept me inspired and motivated and uplifted me and held me accountable for the work that I was doing, right? And to me, that was those were the people that were in positions to really help me, right? I didn't necessarily have a lot of mentors per se, but I felt that my peers that I was connected with early on were kind of my mentors and the people that inspired me and motivated me to do big things. And we all had big dreams and big goals because we came from the same kind of places. We didn't have many opportunities coming in. And so we were already kind of behind the eight ball, but we kind of galvanized each other behind that, right? And we had dreams of doing big things and achieving big goals. And that was really a unique support system to have, of having those peers and that collective group that are holding each other accountable and uplifting each other as we all went on our individual journeys.
Well, it's just like that community you were just mentioning, and it clearly went a long way. I mean, surrounding
Mhm.
yourself with like-minded individuals who have aspirations that are big, as you said, just it's almost like it's more of a support system, and also just to live by example.
Yeah,
It's clearly affected you very positively. So I'm very happy to hear that.
yeah, absolutely, definitely. Mhm.
And it's evident that in history, a lot of Black inventions and inventors are all too forgotten. Could you tell me any inventors in history and their stories that have resonated with you over time?
Yeah, that's actually a great story because I did have the amazing opportunity to meet an actual Black inventor who is pretty historic. I got a chance to interview Lonnie Johnson. He is a former aeronautics engineer, worked with NASA and some other space organizations. But he is the founder and inventor of the Super Soaker and Nerf gun. And that was a really unique experience. I was doing some creative content at this manufacturing expo, and I didn't know that he was speaking beforehand until I got there, and I noticed that he was doing a session later on in the day, and I was like, I have to hear this guy's story. And hearing his story live for the first time, and showing all the inequities that he went through. I forget where he was raised, but it was somewhere down south. And obviously, at that time, a lot of racial issues going on, right? And so there was a lot that he had to overcome just to be able to get to this position that he was in. But hearing his story and seeing his path and his journey of motivating, inspiring himself, and then making that transition from going from an engineer to now having an idea of something creative that he wanted to do and developing something on the side, to me, that was the most profound part of hearing his story because that was something that I had always been involved in. No matter what I was doing, within my engineering work, I always had these other aspirations. I always had these creative outlets of other things that I wanted to do and develop. And I think kind of low key, I always kind of wanted to be an inventor. That was always something that was cool to me. I always wanted to be able to create something. And I guess creating a business and starting a business is an invention in itself, but a physical actual invention is something that I always thought would be the coolest thing to do. And then, obviously growing up and playing with super soakers, right, and Nerf guns, you have that connection. And to be able to see that this was a Black man and also a Black engineer that developed this was such a unique story. And having the chance to interview him after his session was really cool. He was really receptive. I told him a little bit about my hip hop science platform and what I was trying to do. And we walked outside and we did a full fledged interview and got to go in depth about his story and kind of his vision and other things that he was working on. And to be able to have that opportunity to speak with an icon and somebody that's legendary, and you always kind of look at these prominent figures in Black history, right? And you have like your George Washington Carvers and all these other people, the first women in space and Black women in space, all these different figures, right? To be able to have somebody that was a tangible figure like that in my presence was definitely an uplifting moment for sure.
That is just another amazing experience that you've had. And I, like many other children, including yourself, was a big fan of the Super Soaker growing up, and
Yeah.
I definitely had my fair share of Nerf guns. And it's I don't think many people know that Lonnie Johnson was a black man, is a black man.
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
think that's something that's quite often overlooked. I didn't know until maybe I was 16. I
Mhm.
happened to speak with one of my parents about it, and they mentioned him.
Mhm. Yep, absolutely. And that's why it's so important to know those stories, right? Because a lot of times within our communities, we don't even know our own history, right? And that's something that sets us back and you can go back generations of not knowing our history as far as where we came from and our origins and our roots, right? But then just even within our professional roots and all these different things that we utilize in technology and all these other inventions that have had such a societal impact, a lot of times we don't even know these stories. And the more we know, the more uplifting and the more that it helps us and galvanizes us and brings us together, because now we see the possibilities and we see the opportunities and we know that we do belong in these fields and we have a place in these fields because historically we have been represented and we've made impacts in society. And I think those stories need to be uplifted and need to be told more, especially outside of just Black History Month, where we highlight these Black figures doing amazing things. Black History Month needs to be truly every single month. And we need to highlight these figures that have done amazing things and have made impacts. And the more that we're able to do that, we're not only able to know and understand our roots, but we're also able to inspire our youth that are coming up as well.
I completely agree. And yes, it shouldn't be narrowed down to 1 month. I think that's something that just needs to be like any other part of history, it just needs to be taught on a regular basis. That's the only way
Mm-hmm.
that we're going to know and that these people from our histories are going to get the exposure that they deserve.
Yep, 100%. Yep. And that becomes a little difficult because that's a whole nother conversation now where we start to talk about this whole battle with like CRT, right? Critical race theory being taught in classrooms. And that's a whole nother discussion we could get into.
Yeah, it's a hot topic at the moment for sure.
Mhm, mhm.
Well, Maynard, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time to let me sit down with you and just talk to you about your experiences. And I hope you stay safe, and I look forward to what you've got next.
Yes, no, thank you so much for having me. And this is a great platform. We need to have these type of conversations more often, right? Because it's important that we see each other that are doing this work in these spaces and that we continue to have this conversation so that we do make changes in the future. And no matter what the reach is, somebody's going to come back and look at this and understand the importance and type of impact that it can make. And hopefully we now start to set some little incremental foundation of change that could really be able to make a long-standing impact on the future.
I agree, and I hope so too.
Mhm.
Take care now, and have a
All
great
right,
rest of the
thank
day.
you. Appreciate it.